No bye weeks, minimal injuries, a ton of guys you can actually start. We don't need to talk about the top two tiers. Everybody knows them. They're in your lineup. Let's go ahead and let's lead off tier 3 with Mike Evans. If you were looking at Evans, yes, this first week back was very disappointing. I mean, you only had 11 fantasy points, but if you look at the actual usage, Mike Evans only played 60% of the snaps. So while they told us Mike Evans was going to be 100%, in reality, they definitely limited him. Now, obviously, it was a game that the Bucs absolutely blew the Giants out of the water. So here I'd assume that Evans probably gets a little bit closer to 70, 80% of snaps this week against the Carolina Panthers. And I think you could see natural progression from where he was a week ago. You do have an implied team total as well, about 26.5 points for this Bucs offense. So it should be one of the higher scoring offenses in the league this week. You'll see how high we rank Bucky Irving in the rankings later. But anyway, looking at CeeDee Lamb, typically we have actually seen the Dallas Cowboys only project out to have 16-ish points scored with Cooper Rush under center. But it looks like they're actually changing that this week. Sportsbooks have the Dallas Cowboys with an implied team total about 20.5 points. And every single week, pretty much over the past 2 months, you've been able to pencil CeeDee Lamb in for double-digit targets as well. So Lamb, a super comfortable start. Am I sitting here ranking him as a tier 1 option? No, obviously the offense is worse with no Dak. On Underdog, he is currently higher, lower, 65.5 receiving yards. Now, going over to our next wide receiver, we will be looking at Terry McLaurin. Now, if Terry did not have the long receiving touchdown this past week on the busted punt, it could have been very ugly, right? You could have had Terry McLaurin with a 2-point performance against Philly, then carrying it over with a horrible performance against the Dallas Cowboys. But I'm willing to take a step back and I'm willing to say, well, you know what? This still should be a decent offense. You have an applied team total of 24.5 points against Tennessee. So sportsbooks are giving a lot of credit to the Commanders. Terry McLaurin has scored the 5th most fantasy points out the wide receiver position this season. That's total points, not points per game. So I'm willing to stand by Terry McLaurin. His underdog picks, higher, lower, 60.5 receiving yards. But honestly, I wouldn't mind at all if you wanted to go the higher then. Going over to Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill had been higher in these rankings over the past 2 weeks. A lot of that had to do, obviously, with bye weeks, not only bye weeks, but also, if you had been looking at sportsbooks over the past 2 weeks, they had been projecting out the Miami Dolphins as one of the highest scoring offenses in the NFL. You had had implied team totals up at 26, 27 points, which had made Tua a very interesting streaming option, which had made Tyreek Hill, at least in my projections, a very easy wide receiver one. But here you actually have the implied team total much lower against the Green Bay Packers. We've seen Tua struggle in the cold, blah, 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 blah. But here, I think you have to put Tyreek Hill still as the wide receiver one in Miami, despite Waddle scoring all the points last week. Malik Neighbors will be our next receiver. If you're looking at Neighbors, he's still near the very top of the NFL in targets per game. It was very ugly against the Bucs last week, right? Where Neighbors had absolutely nothing in the first half. I'm sure you've seen by now that every clip going viral is Neighbors taking shots at this coaching staff. I mean, he is the squeaky wheel right now in this offense. Typically, the squeaky wheel wide receiver will get the ball the next week to kind of calm him down. But it is a tough situation in general just to look for touchdown upside, where you do have an implied team total of 16.5 points. And right now on Underdog, you have like a 1.77x multiplier score touchdown for Neighbors. So the receptions will be there. The touchdown's just going to be hard to come by. It's going to be very interesting to follow the New York Jets situation with Aaron Rodgers. You have this Jets offense projecting to score about 19.5 points this week. Obviously, over the past 2 weeks, Garrett Wilson has given you absolute stinkers with 9 fantasy points and 5.5 fantasy points. But this is following the 30-point performance where, I mean, people are trying to tell me in the comment section that Wilson was a top 5 wide receiver, regardless of Davante Adams' presence and regardless of how bad this offense is. Now, of course, I'll reiterate time and time again, the saving grace for Garrett Wilson, Davante Adams, Breece Hall in this offense is that nobody else is going to touch the ball outside of these 3 players. Courtland Sutton will be our next option. Here, Courtland Sutton has just turned into an absolute must-start wide receiver. You can say that Bo Nix, probably the best quarterback that Courtland Sutton's had in his entire NFL career at this point, with how Bo Nix is playing right this second. I mean, over the past 5 games, Courtland Sutton is averaging about 10 targets per contest. Over the past 5 games, Courtland Sutton is averaging about 90 to 95 receiving yards per game as well. And finally, you get the positive touchdown regression this past week where you get the 2 touchdowns against the Raiders and you get the 30 points dropped. If you actually look at the underdog projections at the moment, they have Courtland Sutton higher lower 64.5 receiving yards, which obviously is crushed over the past 5 weeks consistently. But that is a higher mark than what you have with players like Tyreek Hill, like Terry McLaurin. So honestly, if you look at the underdog projections, they would have Courtland Sutton up ranked more so at wide receiver 9 than wide receiver 15. Regardless, he will be a must-start wide receiver. Going over to T. Higgins, it's a little bit of a tougher matchup, of course, going against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Typically, we have seen that the Cincinnati Bengals project to be a top 3 offense in the NFL in points scored. Here you have an applied team total 25 points, which isn't bad by any means. And what's actually very interesting is you do have the Cincinnati Bengals favored in this contest as well by about 3 points. But in the about 6 games that T. Higgins has played, I mean, especially if you remove the first week back from his injury to start the season, you've seen 12, 29, 14, 18, and 29 fantasy points. So this is a highly concentrated offense between the top 2 options. And obviously, Burrow's been providing so much passing volume here. Now, Ladd McConkey will be our next player. It honestly pains me to talk about Ladd in this fashion because we went through and traded away Ladd for a receiver that's lower in these rankings. We'll talk about in a second. But, I mean, here it's a great matchup going up against the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, with Ladd McConkey, this is a wide receiver that has consistently been the top target earner in this offense. The issue, of course, is when the Chargers win, they are going to run the ball consistently in the second half. Here, it is a close spread against the Atlanta Falcons, though. You potentially have no J.K. Dobbins, so it seems like maybe they're going to have a few more dropbacks for Justin Herbert. And right now, Ladd McConkey is also about 64.5 receiving yards for his higher lower on underdog, which again is higher than what you have with players like Malik Neighbors and Garrett Wilson at the moment. Now, Jaden Reed will be our next option. Now, with Jaden Reed, y'all know, I mean, we've been a hater pretty much after, I want to say any 30-point performance you've had. We've been screaming from the rooftop, sell, sell, sell. But that's because he has 1 game with more than 6 targets this season. And I know you're tired of hearing me say that, but it's the truth. It's been happening. Now, of course, he's been one of the most efficient wide receivers in the entire NFL from a per target perspective. So he's been able to get there in a ton of these spots. Now, I will say the saving grace with Jaden Reed this week is it seems like Romeo Doubs will be out with the concussion. And with that being the case, I could very easily see this as a performance where Jaden Reed gets to 6, 7 targets, especially if they are forced to throw the ball a little bit more against the Miami Dolphins. So I'll be ranking Jaden Reed higher than his projections this week, primarily because the Doubs injury, opening up a few more targets. And honestly, I wouldn't mind at all, and this is probably the first time we've said this all season, going with the higher than on Jaden Reed's receiving yards at 50.5, assuming that you have no Doubs. And of course, if you wanted to tail us on that, I would warn you, I'm like 1 for 1,000 on our underdog calls this season. But you can find the link to Underdog Fantasy in the description, in the comment section, available in damn near every state. If you use code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, on top of that, you are going to be getting a free Jordan Love pick, more than less than half a total yard for Thanksgiving. Plus, you're going to be getting a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night. Just go through the link in the description or comment section and make sure that you use promo code FLOCK. Now, going over to our next player, we are going to be looking at Mr. George Pickens. With Pickens, it's a really favorable matchup that you have going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. Should be a higher scoring game environment than what we're typically used to with these Pittsburgh games. You do have an over-under of this game right now at about 47 points. And while George Pickens was very disappointing against the Cleveland Browns this past week, obviously it was the snow game, and George Pickens was like 3 feet off of having another massive performance with Russ. And if you look at the games where George Pickens has played with Russell Wilson this season, you've had 22, 11, 20, 17, and about 9 fantasy points. So Pickens has been consistent. I think it's a really good matchup as well. To be honest with you, Pickens should probably be ahead of Jaden Reed here. If you look at the pick'em on George Pickens, he's actually higher, lower 70.5 receiving yards. So you know what? If you check out the rankings on flockfantasy.com, I think given how good this matchup is and the larger sample we've seen with Russell Wilson at this point, George Pickens is probably going to jump ahead of Reed, Ladd, and T. Higgins, and Pickens will probably end up being the wide receiver 15, wide receiver 16 for us this week. I'm going over to DK Metcalf. Freaking hate that I traded Sal Lad McConkey for this dude. I mean, this was what I perceive to be some big time upgrade. I will throw in Jackson Smith-Njigba right after in these rankings, because this is now back-to-back weeks where JSN has outproduced Metcalf from a targets perspective, a receptions perspective, and receiving yards, fantasy points, the whole 9 yards, the whole enchilada, whatever the hell you want to say. It's super frustrating. This is a bad matchup going up against the New York Jets. You have an implied team total of only about 22.5 points in this offense here. I really hope we get a big Metcalf blow-up game, but the last time you had 20 points in a game for Metcalf was week 3. JSN, if he has another performance where he goes through and he leads this team in every major statistical category, I think next week will be the first week ever we put JSN ahead of Metcalf in our rankings. Now, going over to 22, we will have Marvin Harrison Jr. With Harrison, super up and down this season. I mean, you are looking at only a total of 5 games with more than 15 fantasy points. And you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games with fewer than 10. Obviously, ignoring the game he leaves early due to the injury back in week 6. So he's been very much up and down. The benefit of the matchup that you have this week going up against Minnesota is the Vikings have actually allowed a considerable amount of points to opposing wide receivers this year. I mean, obviously, you actually have the Minnesota Vikings favored in this game by 3.5 points. So it's probably a spot where we have a decent amount of Kyler Murray dropbacks and pass attempts. But the issue is this past week, every single one of those went to Trey McBride. Looking at Davante Adams, again, I think you have to monitor the situation that we are going to have with Aaron Rodgers. It sounds like Rodgers is on the way out for the Jets. The Jets project to be one of the worst offenses in the league this week. If Rodgers does officially play, I think he can move Davante Adams a little bit up. With Adams, he's had a ton of target volume since he's gone to New York, but at the same time, you have 1 game with more than 20 fantasy points and 3 games with fewer than 10. Looking at DeAndre Hopkins, the snaps simply haven't been there. It is really frustrating. Obviously, this past week against the Panthers, it doesn't really matter because he gets there with the receiving touchdown. But looking at what you've had with DeAndre Hopkins since he has been a Kansas City Chief, you've effectively seen 29, 86, 56, 29, and 35 receiving yards. So Hopkins very much has been a touchdown or bust option. The saving grace that you may have for DeAndre Hopkins is the Chiefs do project out to be a top 3 offense in the NFL this week with an implied team total of 27.5 points. Now, there's a double-edged sword to that. The Chiefs also are so heavy favored in this game that they probably can just run the ball in the second half. Zay Flowers will be our next option. Maybe I'm a little bit salty here with Zay Flowers that we missed our underdog call with him on Monday. I thought we were going to go fewer than 59.5 receiving yards. He gets 62, but it is what it is. Can't hold that against him. That's my fault, not his. With Flowers, I mean, one thing's for sure. It looks like Deontay Johnson is an absolute zero. He's a non-factor. I mean, this past week, you didn't have a ton of Lamar Jackson pass attempts, but you actually did have Flowers commanding a super high percentage of this team's target share at 8. And if you look at over the past, I don't know, say 2 months, you've only had 1 game with fewer than 6 targets for Zay Flowers. So honestly, when we update these rankings on the site later this week, I probably will move Flowers ahead of DeAndre Hopkins for sure. And then I don't want to really speak too much on Darnell Mooney and Devonta Smith. Both players are dealing with hamstring injuries at the moment. I don't know their availability for week 13 yet. Obviously, I'll be live streaming every day this week, trying to give you as many updates as possible. Plus, we'll be updating these rankings on flockfantasy.com with injury news. Going over to Calvin Ridley, super safe target volume that you should expect in Tennessee. Now, with that being said, it is a garbage offense. That is going to be a concern as always. And you do have, I don't know, I mean, just a cap ceiling when it comes to the touchdowns. You've had 2 games this season where Calvin Ridley has actually scored a TD. I know maybe the Titans looked good last week, but they have an implied team total of 19 points this week. You actually have an implied team total of only 19.25 points here for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, with Brian Thomas, he's the last guy left. Super talented option as well. But the issue is, if Trevor Lawrence is not in this offense, the offense is dust. It's Tennessee. Now, if Lawrence does play, especially if you see the implied team total skew a little bit higher for this Jags offense, if it eclipses 20 points, then you could definitely see Brian Thomas move up these rankings. Jerry Jeudy will be our next option. Jerry Jeudy's been great over the past month. You've had 0 games with fewer than 10 fantasy points, and you've had that 26-point bomb that you had back in week 11. Obviously, the 14.5 this past week in a game with horrible weather as well, in a tough matchup against Pittsburgh. So Jerry Jeudy's been great since you've had Jameis Winston under center. As you can tell by these rankings, I think that Jerry Jeudy is probably wide receiver 1 here in Cleveland. But again, I do want to reiterate, if you actually look at the target volume that you've had over the past month here in Cleveland, Elijah Moore, Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, all these guys are seeing about the same amount of targets. So while Judy's been the most efficient guy with them, I think all these receivers are going to be a little bit volatile options. Going over to Juwan Jennings, it is painful to swallow this pill. The Niners are telling us that we should expect Brock Purdy's going to go in week 13, but sportsbooks are telling us that Brock Purdy will be missing. The Niners have an implied team total currently of about 19 points. So if you have an implied team total of 19 points here in San Francisco, the base expectation is Purdy is not starting. It is an absolute garbage offense. You can tell by these rankings that I believe Jennings is probably the number 1 option in this offense, where we've seen over the past 3 weeks, him actually go out there and accumulate a total of 29 targets, averaging about 10 targets a game. But I don't know. Tough matchup against Buffalo. If you have no Purdy, I think he's kind of screwed. Now, of course, if Purdy does end up playing, we'll move him up dramatically. DJ Moore has the absolute blow up this past week. But while you have the 27 fantasy points, you have 7 targets in comparison to Keenan Allen at 15. You have 7 targets in comparison to Rome Odunze at 10. So the efficiency is off the charts. I like DJ Moore, the player. But ultimately, if you're looking at the targets going in the direction of Rome and Keenan, unless you expect that there's just a ton of efficiency and passing volume here in Chicago, which I don't, I think it'd be tough to be excited about DJ Moore. Now, good news is it obviously is a game going up against Detroit where we're going to have a ton of Caleb Williams dropbacks where the Lions should just blow him out of the water. I'm going over to Deebo Samuel. Yep, I throw in the towel. We wave the white flag. Juwan Jennings is wide receiver 1 here. Deebo's just been an absolute train wreck, and I mean a train wreck since he got pneumonia. Now, Jacoby Myers, our next option. If you're looking at Myers, I know a lot of people are going to scream that this is way too low, coming off a game where he played effectively 100% of the snaps, saw 15 targets, 10 receptions, 121 receiving yards, and a really tough matchup against Denver. I completely understand where you're coming from, but hear me out on this. Sportsbooks are telling us that the Raiders will have the worst offense in the NFL this week. They have an implied team total of 15 points. We've seen 2 weeks ago that Brock Bowers can come in, and Bowers can very easily be the guy that just absolutely dominates targets. You have no Gardner Minshew. You have a brutal matchup against the Chiefs. I think it's probably a trap game for Myers. And if you really, really love Myers, I mean, always go take the higher than 53.5 receiving yards on him on Underdog, but I'm not about it. I'm going over to Jamison Williams. Obviously, with Jamison, boom bust, touchdown option. I mean, if you get the long touchdown, it's going to look great. If it's not there, you're not as excited. But I will say, actually, he had a decent game against the Colts without that long touchdown, where he actually had 12 fantasy points, which honestly, super impressive considering the context. Our next 2 guys will be Amari Cooper, Khalil Shakir. I am ranking Amari and Shakir under the assumption that Amari, Shakir, Keon Coleman, and Dalton Kincaid are all good to go. Hypothetically, Keon Coleman's out. You move both Amari and Shakir up these rankings a bit. Hypothetically, if Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid are both out, then you move Amari and Shakir up these rankings even more. So obviously, the more passing options that you have in here, the more we're going to assume that it is dispersed. Where if you are looking at Shakir, he was great over the past few weeks. I mean, over the past 2 weeks, he's had 21 targets. But that's in the context of a ton of these pass catchers being injured. Now, honestly, I don't know why I'm ranking Tank Dell here at 38. It's a good matchup going up against Jacksonville. Y'all know I'm a Tank Dell hater. Y'all know I drafted Jordan Addison absolutely everywhere this season. So I'll tell you, I'm rooting for Jordan Addison here. And also, there's a chance that I may be stuck playing Jalen Waddle again in the Flock League this week, which I will say thank you, Waddle, for coming through with the 28 points for us last week. But with Waddle, I don't know. I'm not buying it. Like before week 12, the last week where you had double-digit fantasy points for Jalen Waddle was week 1. And again, the reason Waddle was a viable pivot last week is if you were looking at sportsbook projections, the Dolphins projected out to be a top 5 offense in the NFL. This week, however, you have an implied team total down at 21.5. They're supposed to be an average offense this week. Keenan Allen, Michael Pittman should have a considerable amount of targets. With Pittman, obviously garbage offense. You have no Josh Downs this week, or at least you can tell that's what we're assuming with these rankings. And then with Keenan Allen, 15 targets this past week. It's the second game all year where you've seen at least 10 fantasy points. Again, I'm not buying it. I don't trust the passing volume here in Chicago. And Rome Odunze, DJ Moore, both having plenty of production in their own right. Like Rome's had back-to-back games with double-digit targets. Xavier Worthy, you're looking at a boom bust, touchdown or bust option. Christian Watson, maybe you can look at him or Dontavian Wicks with no Rome Odunze. And then Keon Coleman is just an absolute Hail Mary. I don't even know if this dude's going to play, but obviously with injuries, I'll be updating the rankings over on flockfantasy.com every chance I get. And of course, if y'all wanted to tail us on any of those underdog picks this week, if you wanted to go higher than on Jaden Reed's 50.5 receiving yards, you can find that link in the description, comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, at the same time, you're going to be getting that free Jordan Love pick, more than less than half a total yard for the Thursday night game. And on top of that, you're going to be getting a free team review in the live stream that we're doing every single day. But I think that's all I got for you. Really do appreciate you, and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later today.